All right, well, thank you all for coming out tonight and spending this very important evening together here. We're having a couple of tech issues, just so you know that the font's gone a little wonky and it's in a different dimension like that, but hopefully it will all be okay. And I recognize not everybody will be able to see it as clearly. It's really more for me than it is for you, just as notes to help me remember what we're going to be talking about. So Richard Ledrede, Ireland's would-be Inquisitor. The good, the bad, and the ugly, I have to confess, I'm going to spend a little more time on the bad and the ugly. But it is the good that brings us here tonight, the Red Book of Ossory, which is among the many things, well, among the things I have to be grateful to Richard Ledrede for, is the way he kept documents. He wrote, almost certainly, he's the one who wrote the proceedings of the narrative of the proceedings against Dame Alice Kyteler. So if we didn't have that, we would know very little. We would basically know what Clyn has to tell us and what Pembridge has to tell us, who are analysts who are writing about 10 years later. Ledrede is almost certainly the author of this text, and the story itself reads like a historical novel. It has all sorts of things that no one narrator could have witnessed, but it tells us so much about what was important to him. And the Red Book represents the more official side of how well he kept records, even of those people who came before him. So as a historian, I am tremendously grateful for everyone who keeps and takes care of records. So if you're in that role, that includes librarians and civil servants in various ways. So thank you for all the work that you do. So he's an Englishman ethnically by birth. We don't know really much about him at all until he first appears in France. So that's where we're going to start, is in France. I have a couple of copies of my book, The Templars, the Witch, and the Wild Irish, and I'll be starting with the Trial of the Templars, because the Trial of the Templars is essential for understanding the environment in which Ledrede formed his sense of the way the world worked, and to understand that, especially as we'll talk about in a little bit, John XXII, the Pope who appointed him the Bishop of Ossory, he really genuinely believed that Satan was stalking the earth, looking for allies to work to overthrow Christendom. And whatever you might feel, especially on a night like tonight, about the truth of that, they genuinely believed that. So they thought that there were people working in concert with Satan to overthrow the Pope and Christ and Christendom generally. But I'm a little cynical about some of those claims, including the claims that were made against the Templars. So if you're not familiar with the Templars, although they tend to be one of the few things people know about medieval Europe, they are the embodiment of the crusading ideal of the knights. They are warriors who are also monks. Okay, so this is a really powerful combination. These are pretty much the two most important roles in the society. And they're a movement that emerged out of the Crusade movement. So the Crusades were first called in 1095, and the Catholics, the Western Europeans, succeeded in taking Jerusalem, which was a really big deal for them, in 1099. It's about 30 years later that the Templars were officially recognized as an order. And eventually they add the role of banker to warrior and monk, because where would be safer to keep your money than with people who are warriors as well as monks, right? And so I'm not really into the history of banking, so I don't know all the intricacies as to how they managed to do this, but it made them extremely wealthy. At the same time, the Western Catholics lost Jerusalem in 1187, and this was devastating to people who believed they were fighting for God, or at least on some level, they believed that they were fighting for God. They saw these as holy wars. So if they lost holy wars against non-Christians, what did that possibly mean about their own spiritual state? What was God saying to them? It got even worse by 1291, when they lost the last little bit of territory that they still had in the Middle East. So the Catholics kept trying to keep fighting the Crusades. Well, they did keep fighting, but they kept losing. And so it only got worse from there. So 1291 is an especially important date to consider, given what happens about 15 years later. So we have the main mover behind the Templar trial is the King of France, Philip IV, who owed the Templars an awful lot of money. And the Templars were, I mean, not to be harsh about it, but they were losers in their main purpose, which is winning back the Holy Land for Christ. And as much as you have to struggle with, well, what does that mean about what God thinks about me? Well, what does it mean about the Templars? If we lost, it must be their fault in some way, right? So they become scapegoats. Thanks to Philip IV of France, there is some evidence that there was some rumors about their moral condition before Philip moved, but Jacques de Molay, who is the head of the Templar order everywhere, he participated in a royal funeral just the day before they were arrested. Right? So he was within the state of grace as far as the king went on the 12th of October, 1307. 13th of October, Friday the 13th, which is why some people think that's why Friday the 13th gets the reputation that it has. Templars all around France were rounded up in the early morning hours, and they were taken and they were tortured, and many of them confessed into what Philip accused them of. Okay, so some of the things he accused them of was blasphemy, which is when you're disrespectful to something sacred. So this included spitting at the cross or worse, worshiping an idol, saying that you renounced Christ, and engaging in homosexuality, which was one of the things when people wanted to discredit other people at this time. That was one of the things they would focus on. We have 138 surviving accounts of the interrogations just from October and November 1307. And of the 138, you see only 4 insisted that they were innocent in all things. 105 admitted that they denied Christ, although they said they did it only orally and not in their hearts. 123 confessed to spitting at, on, or near a crucifix because their superiors said they too should. 102 said that homosexuality was encouraged among them, although only 3 said they did it themselves, and 9 swore that they were worshiping idols. There's virtually no evidence to support this, which isn't to say that some of it was true, or wasn't true, but. Okay, so the Pope at this time, Clement V, he is very shocked by what's just happened to the Templars, and he works to put a hold on things. And when he works to slow things down, many of the Templars recant their confessions, and they said, we only did it because we were tortured into confessing. And so he does suspend the proceedings for a time, but when he does that, Philip starts working to intimidate him as well, including implying that he was a fautor. So fautor is a fancy word of saying like an enabler, an assister, somebody who helps heretics. They're not heretics themselves, but they give them aid in some way and make it so it can happen. And also he starts reapplying pressure regarding his claim that Boniface VIII was a heretic. And also, every time he came to meet the Pope, he had a big army that would accompany him, just to remind him that Ewan Hu's army works much better for him than for the Pope. Okay, so, and just to get a bit of perspective of the kind of person that Philip was, he had done, in 1306, he arrested and expelled the Jews, which is about 100,000 people in France, because he owed them an awful lot of money, just like he owed the Templars an awful lot of money. And he is able to present this as if the Jews were poisonous to the realm of France and that France was cleansing itself of their influence. And before he did this to the Jews, which is also before he did this to the Templars, keep in mind, 1307 is when he rounds up the Templars, he had done something really remarkable to Boniface VIII, who was Pope at the end of the 13th into the beginning of the 14th century. Philip had worked with his men from France, as well as various representatives from Italy, to attack, overthrow, to some extent, Boniface and imprison him in his own home. And they debated, the French were trying to make it so they could take Boniface back to Paris, the Pope, take the Pope back to Paris and try him as a heretic in Paris, and then execute him for heresy. While the Italians were advocating, we should just kill him here. We don't have to take him back to France to do this. And fortunately, they argued long enough that Boniface's supporters were able to rescue him, but he never overcame the shock and humiliation and probably the great physical impairment of what happened to him, and he died within 2 weeks of his rescue. So that's 1303. Okay, so some of the things that Philip was accusing Boniface of is having demons, like worshiping demons and using them as his servants in ways, keeping a familiar, which is an animal or a demon spirit, who will do your work, and conjuring demons by sacrificing a cock. He said to be an apostate. Apostate is a fancy word for someone who renounces their faith. Also a murderer and a sodomite. These are kind of standard accusations for people you're trying to discredit. And when he's trying to pressure Clement to renew the proceedings against the Templar, he also is saying that Boniface was in league with the Templars, that everything he's saying the Templars are doing, Boniface was doing with them too. Okay. And yes, Boniface was working with the Templars, as pretty much everybody with power was working with the Templars before they fell so quickly and decisively from grace. So Philip handpicked 72 Templars, or he and his men handpicked 72 Templars who confirm that their confessions were genuine, and they swear that they were not tortured. So Clement decides that throughout Christendom, there are going to be diocesan inquests, which also happened in Ireland, in Dublin. And he's going to establish a papal commission to investigate the order as a whole. So he's willing to go along with what Philip is saying, but he's going to make sure that the Pope and the Church remain in control of a heresy proceeding, which is what should happen. He also is calling a general ecclesiastical council that can decide the order for themselves, or at least investigate the accusations and the evidence. And this is what happens with the Council of Vienne in 1311 to 1312. And while the Pope has this control, hundreds and hundreds of Templars say, we confessed because we were tortured into saying it. None of this is true. And it seemed from February to April 1310, which coincidentally is the time period when the Templars in Dublin were being examined as well. It seemed during this time, because it was moving so much in the direction of people listening to what the Templars themselves had to say about their innocence and about the torture, it seemed like maybe the trial could have gone a different way. But Philip has 54 of the nearly 600 Templars who had recanted their confessions sent to the stake on the 12th of May, 1310. And a contemporary chronicler at the time recorded that all of them, with no exception, until the end, acknowledged none of the crimes imputed to them, but constantly persisted in the general denial, saying always that they were being put to death without cause and unjustly, which indeed many of the people were able to observe with great admiration and immense surprise. There were genuine heretics at this time, people, for example, who didn't believe that Jesus had a physical body, for example, which is, an article of the faith, that he actually did have a body, and through the suffering of that body, he redeemed sins. When you have people who have genuine heretical beliefs, they frequently, much like the martyrs of early Christendom, when they go to their death, they often, not always, obviously, but often embrace that faith. And they say it's really the church who's an agent of Satan, and they are being released. And with the Templars, the only point on which they differed was whether or not they were innocent. So those who insisted on their innocence were sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, whereas those Templars who confirmed their confessions were reconciled, released. The last executions occur in 1314, when Jacques de Molay, the head of the order, as well as the preceptor of Normandy, were burned. There's a fascinating story about Jacques de Molay's supposed curse of both Clement and Philip IV and the Capetians, but maybe later we can talk about that. So during while this was happening, so Clement himself was French, and during the allegations being made against the Templars and the trial of the Templars, he eventually relocates to Avignon. So the papacy, the papacy begins as the Bishop of Rome, that's all the Pope is, but Rome has not become the most hospitable place in the eyes of these popes. I mean, there's a reason why Italians were like, oh, why don't we just kill the Pope here when it was Boniface, right? So Clement moves the papacy to Avignon, which is where it stays for most of the 14th century. Okay, and just to give you a sense of about right here, so southern France, and it's technically not part of the Kingdom of France, but it's definitely within Philip IV's orbit. So the next pope is John the 22nd. He's pope from 1316 to 1334. He also is a Frenchman, like Clement, and he's convinced that necromancers, and necromancers are clerics, so it's an order of the priestly class, who believe that they can summon demons, so that they can get demons to do their bidding in different ways. They're not, in their minds, they're not worshiping demons. They're using demons. They have greater power in their mind. Their critics are saying, if you enter into any kind of arrangement with a demon, you become that demon's servant. You might think you're in control, but really it's the demons who are in control. But John was convinced that there were necromancers who were constantly scheming, trying to kill him, trying to overthrow Christendom. Remember what I said about Satan stalking the earth at all times, looking for allies. And he, as soon as he becomes pope, he goes after some of his own personal enemies, accusing them of being necromancers who are trying to use these demons to hurt him, and he has them convicted for heresy and brutally executed. In 1320, he helps bring about what some scholars have called a doctrinal revolution, in that it recognizes that actions can be seen as proof of heresy. So heresy is technically a matter of belief. It's not a matter of deed. But from 1320 on, thanks to what John the 22nd arranges with certain scholars, that they agree that deeds show you what people really believe. So deeds can be taken as proof of heresy. Okay, so this is important with the Kilkenny case. He has an intense conflict with the Franciscans. So Francis of Assisi, who lived from 1181 to 1226. Francis founded the Franciscan order, which was an incredibly popular order. Very quickly, all across Western Christendom, people were flocking to his order. And one of the things that's particularly notable about the Franciscans is it gets called the cult of poverty. So they really embrace the idea of voluntary poverty and not owning possessions and living an austere life. And John saw this as a criticism of him, because he did not live an austere life. He had a lot of comforts, the church had a lot of wealth, and so he was not comfortable with anyone saying that wealth was a sign of sin or of evil or whatever. So he issued a series of bulls requiring Franciscans to formally reject the claim that Christ and the apostles held no property. So held no property, neither individually nor in common, which is one of the things that Francis actually was encouraging his own followers to do. And he, in fact, took it as far as to execute 4 Franciscans who refused to agree to this change. But Ledrede, it has to be noted, was the kind of Franciscan that John could appreciate, because Ledrede really liked wealth and Ledrede really liked beauty. And you can see that the Episcopal palace that he has. He also had a beautiful stained glass window that he had made that didn't survive Cromwell. But also to keep in mind the role of Franciscans more broadly at this time. So Edward Bruce invaded Ireland in 1315. Robert Bruce, his brother, had just won at Bannockburn in 1314. So Robert had been able to militarily get himself recognized, not by Edward, but by many people in Scotland, as the king in France. And they decided that, well, Edward would come over to Ireland and Edward would try to become king of Ireland. And so then you'd have the Bruces in Scotland and the Bruces in Ireland, and they could work together to get rid of the English in England and in Wales, and generally speaking. So the Franciscans in Ireland were seen as being particularly sympathetic to Edward's cause and to be inspiring rebellion. So when the Archbishop of Cashel, who was an Irishman, a Gaelic Irishman, died in 1316, Edward II, the King of England, asked that John appoints an Englishman to combat, quote, the fraudulent tricks and crafty and deceitful collusions of certain Irish prelates who were inspiring rebellion against Edward and for the Bruces. And he specifically asked for an English Franciscan, and saying he also wants no native Irish to be promoted, quote, at least as long as the current disturbances there continued. So what John did is he translated, which means he moved, William FitzJohn, who was the Bishop of Ossory, he moved him to the Archdiocese of Cashel. And he grants Edward's request for an English Franciscan with Ledrede. And we know nothing about Ledrede before this. So we don't know why he chose Ledrede. And when Edward thanked John for doing this, he really waxes lyrical about what a virtuous and honest and faithful character William FitzJohn is, which if you know William FitzJohn, you know that's a big question mark. But when Edward gets to Ledrede, he's only grateful. The only things he specifically calls out is that he's an English Franciscan. Okay, so Edward is clearly grateful for that, but he doesn't know who Ledrede is. Edward would come to regret this appointment, as would his son. So the real connection is between John the 22nd and Ledrede. And when John wrote the letter appointing Ledrede, he celebrates him in pretty much the same kind of terms that Edward described William FitzJohn, but we don't know what really caused him to select this man. And it's also interesting, so this is the first time when John the 22nd appoints Ledrede Bishop of Ossory, this is the first time a pope ever claims as his right to fill a benefice when it's vacant because the occupant has been moved to a different position. It was one thing if somebody died at the curia, then the pope would claim this right, but this time he himself created the vacancy and then he filled it. Ledrede describes himself as, quote, cultivated, educated, and promoted under the wings of the most holy apostolic see, which might indicate that he studied in Avignon and he may have become a teacher there. It's possible that he distinguished himself while John the 22nd was Bishop of Avignon, which was from 1310 to 1312, which was when the Council of Vienne was. But it's also, when you see what Ledrede did, it's quite possible that John knew he would do something like that. John saw some similarities between the two of them. So the first few years, and just to give you a sense, this is just a Google map. If you were to drive from Avignon to Kilkenny, this is what you would do. He did this, so we know he was in Avignon. He was appointed Bishop of Ossory on the 24th of April. He's in London by the 7th of August. He moved quickly. He had to, uproot his life and get over there. And then by the 6th of October, he's not only here, he's already holding a synod here. He's already holding a meeting. So he was a very motivated, well-organized person who could accomplish that. Very few of us could do that now, let alone in 1317. So at the synod, he immediately starts accusing clerical abuses. He's saying the clergy aren't living up to the standards of virtue that they should have. And he also instructs everyone to report any heresy that they've heard of. And really, we have virtually no references to heresy in Ireland, apart from the trial of the Templars in 1310, which is something that they had to participate in because the Pope ordered that for what we already talked about. And then we also have Bernard of Clairvaux, who was writing in his Life of Malachy of Armagh. He references a cleric of Lismore who didn't believe that the Eucharist was actually Jesus's body and blood. So those are the only references that we really have at this time to heresy. But Ledrede believes there's always heresy. There will always be heretics. The problem isn't that it's not there, so there's no one to report it. It's that no one's reporting it when it is obviously going to be there because it's everywhere. He's also really off to a rough start, and it's important to keep in mind because certain things will happen later that he acts like could never happen to a bishop when it happened to him a few years earlier, including that his temporalities, which are like the properties that he gets money from, have been seized by 1318. That's the year after he comes to Kilkenny. He had been arrested by 1320. Already, and we know this because of a letter from the Pope complaining to Edward about this. But as troubled as this time obviously was, it's going to get a lot more troubling. Okay, so before we start on the Hitler case itself, there's just a couple of terms I want to go over to make sure that we understand them in the same way. So the heresy, if I ask my students to define heresy, usually they'll say something, if they have enough of a sense of what it is, to say it's something like dangerous lies or false teachings of the church. But what heresy literally means is choice. Because you're choosing to believe something different than what the authorities want you to understand as the truth. So this is as opposed to orthodoxy. Orthodoxy literally means straight or right or correct, proper thinking or teaching or belief. So everybody, generally people think their beliefs are right or they would change them. So as to who decides what's heretical and what's truth, it often comes down to who has the force to back up their understanding of things. The Inquisition, it's not really the Inquisition with a capital I, it's a form of investigation, inquisitio, which is an improvement over something like the trial by ordeal. If you think of something like, let's throw her in the water and see if she drowns. If she sinks, well, sorry, we were wrong. But if she floats, then the water rejected her and now she's a witch and now we'll finish the job. So the Inquisition is actually an investigation, but it is an investigation that pretty much starts from the premise that you're guilty. If you were brought to the notice of the people there, they assume chances are high that there's a reason for it. The word sortilegia is sorcery, literally, which means the legia. It has to do with reading and lots and oracles, so divination, how you're going to predict the future. The most common word for witchcraft is maleficium in the singular, maleficia in the plural. It literally means evil doing. Evil. Necromancy, which we talked a little bit about, which literally means divination through the dead, because it used to be, and if you think about the witch of Endor from the Bible and the ideal that Saul could summon up the spirit of Samuel, or he could have the witch of Endor do it for him and communicate with the dead to learn things. But eventually over time, it becomes understood that that's not the dead, those are demons that you're talking to. So that's how you get demon worship from something that means divination through the dead. If you are found guilty of heresy, generally speaking, if it's your first offense, they generally will, if you renounce it, they'll prescribe some penance that you have to perform. But as long as you stay clean after that, you can continue on after you've performed your penance. If it's your second time, then you're what's called a relapsed heretic. You fell back into it like a dog to its vomit, is often quoting the Bible for it, where they get that. And if you're a relapsed heretic, then you are relapsed, which sounds a lot nicer than it is, because what they mean by that is handing them over to secular authority who will burn you alive. And then also just magic comes from the Greek word for Persian priests, and Greeks really didn't like the Persians at all. And it has an inherently pejorative, like insult sense to it, with the sense that we do religion, they do magic. So it's inherently suspect religious practices of the other. And just especially since tonight's the night, the hocus pocus actually comes from a corruption of the Latin, hocus corpus meum, which means this is my body, which is what the Catholic priest says during the Eucharist. And they were, it's a Protestant criticism of transubstantiation. So going with Ledrede Synod and how it connects with the trial. So the very first article of the Constitution from the Synod says that people have to, within a month, report anything they know about heresy. And by early 1324, somebody does, and it's one of Alice's stepchildren, Richard de Val, whom Alice had to sue for her widow's dower in 1316. So when a woman's husband died under the English system, she was entitled to 1/3 of his property as her dower. And Alice had a few husbands. And Richard didn't think that Alice should get his father's property, so he didn't. He tried to prevent her from having her dower, and she sued successfully, and she got that dower. For her various husbands, the first husband, we don't know his name, but we generally assume his name to be William Outlaw, because that is the name of her one known child, William Outlaw, and we assume that it's probable he was named after her father. Or his father, rather. By 1302, she had married her probable second husband, Adam of Callan, who in 1307 quitclaimed all his property to Alice's son, William, which is suspicious. I grant you that. It means that he had given all his possessions to Alice's son, who was not his son. By 2 years later, she had married probable husband number 3, Richard de Val, and we know he was also dead by 1316 because she was suing for his dower, for her dower of his property. And by 1324, when this trial began, she was married yet again to a knight, John the Quair, who is said to be on death's door, allegedly because of her poisoning him. And he is some kind of kinsman to Arnold de Quair, who is a very important figure in the case and in the colony generally, but we are not sure what that relationship is exactly, but just thought he's maybe his brother. Okay, so Alice was an incredibly wealthy woman. And, obviously she's getting wealthier through her dowry. Norman Cohn, who's one of the experts of heresy and witchcraft persecutions, he notes of this case that all the charges, in fact, are designed to serve one and the same purpose, to show that Lady Alice had no right to her wealth, that it had been wrested from its rightful owners by truly diabolic means, that it was tainted at the source. We also see in the narrative, which is the account that's almost certainly Ledrede's own account of the proceedings against Alice Kyteler, that he had already been sued by another widow because when her husband died, he claimed her husband's property. And we also know that she was a daughter of a Flemish merchant family, so she was probably had some wealth from her family as well, from her father. And her first husband, an outlaw, also has a very powerful family member, Roger Outlaw, who is often the chancellor, which is pretty much the second most important judicial role in the colony. And we also know that, like, every time she marries, she seems to be marrying up into an even wealthier and more powerful class. So as we said about the quitclaiming, we know she was a moneylender with her husbands and her son. We know she had to sue for her widow's dower in 1316. We know that Ledrede had already taken another woman's money because he said she didn't have the right to the dower. Eventually, when Ledrede goes through a lot in order to pursue this case, and when he finally is able to order her arrest and have it followed through on, he declares that as a sorceress, a magician, a heretic, and as one who has relapsed, but she hadn't yet been tried, so she couldn't be relapsed. You have to be found guilty of something before you can fall back into it. That she was to be relaxed in the secular arm and her property confiscated. So he immediately wanted to move to her execution and taking her property. We don't know what happened to her fortune at the end, but it's important to know that the case against her was based on and permeated with tension over a woman's right to inherit property, which we know he tried to interfere with somebody else. An important connection is made by Richard Kyteler about the connection with necromancers. So as Richard Kyteler says, insofar as necromancers contributed to the plausibility of claims about witches, they bear indirect responsibility for the rise of the European witch trials in the 15th and following centuries. To the extent that these early witch trials focused on female victims, they thus provide a particularly tragic case of women being blamed and punished for the misconduct of men. Women who were not invoking demons could more easily be thought to do so at a time when certain men were in fact so doing. He says this in his introduction to an actual necromancer's manual. We know that they think they were doing these things, summoning demons. And again, they didn't think they were worshiping the demons, or at least that's not what they say. But then the kind of things, Ledrede would have been familiar with necromancers, or at least the allegations against necromancers. Remember, John the 22nd handpicked him for this office, and John the 22nd was particularly concerned about clerical necromancers. Okay, so as I mentioned about the narrative of the proceedings against Dame Alice Kyteler, it often reads more like historical fiction than clear case of what actually happened. So the dates are a little hard to know exactly what happened when, but he clearly begins by citing Alice for heresy and for witchcraft. And then he has a back and forth as he's trying to have Alice arrested. But the rule was you had to, if you're going to order the arrest of someone for a religious crime like this, you have to give them at least 40 days to answer you. And only when they have not answered within that 40 days can you then order their arrest. And he wants to move immediately to arrest. And so Roger Outlaw, who is the Chancellor of Ireland and kin to her first husband, and Arnold the Quair, who's the seneschal of Kilkenny, and he's the kin to her current husband. They both vehemently and persistently oppose Ledrede and defend Alice. And keep in mind, part of what Ledrede is saying is that she's killing her husbands. Her husbands are their kinsmen, and they are her biggest defenders. So it's very important. They knew her better than any of us here knew, and they stuck by her side consistently. Sometime during Lent 1324, Arnold arrested Ledrede and imprisoned him in Kilkenny Castle. And in retaliation, Ledrede placed all of Ossory under interdict. And that means that no sacraments can be performed without special permission, right? So you can't receive, you can't have masses even, you can't have baptisms, you can't do all sorts of things that you think are really important for your life. At some point, Ledrede turned not just on Alice, but also her son, William. We don't know exactly why or when, but it's pretty clear it has to do with his support for her and his trying to protect her. The Archbishop of Dublin's vicar, so the Archbishop of Dublin, Alexander de Bicknor, is not in Ireland at this time. He's serving the king outside of Ireland. So instead, William Rogerd, who's the Dean of St. Patrick's in Dublin, is acting as the Archbishop while Alexander's away. And Rogerd summons Ledrede to ask him to explain why he put Ossory under interdict, but Ledrede refused to go and answer that question. And so Rogerd removes that interdict. And Rogerd will be very important in a little bit. So the first date that the proceedings tell us about is the 23rd of April. And at this point, Ledrede sends representatives to Arnold's court to ask for help with the arrest, and Ledrede does not get what he wants. So then Ledrede totally decks out in all his episcopal finery, and he's also holding the Eucharist and monstrance before him as he's going, asking again for Arnold's help in pursuing Alice Kyteler. And Arnold says, according to the proceedings of the narrative, or the narrative of the proceedings against Dame Alice Kyteler, that worthless, churlish tramp from England with that lump of dough that he carries in his hands should have to go stand back with the other thieves. So he's not sympathetic. During this time, Alice goes to Dublin and sues Ledrede for defamation, which is fascinating, and for also excommunicating her without allowing her to have due process. Then in May 1324, at the Dublin Parliament, there's this really momentous confrontation between Ledrede and Arnold, but at this parliament, William Rogerd then gives his assistance to Ledrede. According to, this is recorded in the narrative of the proceedings, so again, it's probably coming from Ledrede, but I find it plausible. Arnold says to the assembled nobles before him that if a tramp from England or somewhere has obtained a bull or privilege from the papal curia, we're not bound to obey that bull unless it has been enjoined on us under the king's seal. We say this because, as you well know, heretics have never been found in Ireland. Rather, it is customarily called the Isle of the Saints. Now, however, some foreigner comes from England and says we're all heretics and excommunicants, claiming for himself some papal constitutions which we've never heard of before now. And since defamation of this land touches every one of us, you all ought to unite with me against this man. Unfortunately for Arnold, he was not successful in that appeal. And part of the reason is because of Ledrede's order, the Franciscans. So again, importance of the Franciscans. In 1316, Edward II, the King of England, and that also means he's king of the land that it controls, including the colony in Ireland, which includes Kilkenny. Edward wrote to the head of the Franciscan order demanding action against Irish brothers who supported Edward Bruce and spurred the Irish to rebellion. And William Rogerd is in charge of the commission that the Pope set up to investigate these charges. And on the 7th of April, 1324, what they decided was that the troublesome Irish Franciscans were to be spread out into Anglo-Irish houses, and no Gaelic Irish were to be heads of the friaries, which had caused the greatest problems. There's a tremendous outcry because the Irish had founded most of these houses and they were being kicked out of these houses, and they were going to be parceled out and under control from colonists. And there was enough of an outcry that William had to revise this. So he makes a few changes to allow 2 of the 8 problem friaries, as well as 4 other houses, to retain Irish guardians. And then these 6 houses are going to be a single Irish custody. He had Ledrede at the Parliament, he had Ledrede agree to this. And with Ledrede's support, he's able to get this done. Ledrede is the highest ranking Franciscan at the Parliament. He's one of the two highest rankings Franciscans in all of Ireland at this time. So his support was really important. And after this Parliament, things change and Ledrede is able to get things done. So on the 6th of June is when Ledrede asks Walter Islip and John Darcy, who are, John Darcy is like the head of the colony, the justiciar, for help arresting Alice and 11 named accomplices. This is the first time that 10 of these names appear at all. We knew about William and Alice, but we don't know why these people were also being accused. We have no evidence of any connection between the two. I know there's that tradition of Petronilla being Alice's maid. It's even on the posters over there, but that's not in the medieval sources. That's a later tradition that developed. On the 2nd of July, Alice was tried in absentia, and she was convicted as a sorceress, magician, heretic, and as relapsed. Again, she had not been tried previously, so she can't be relapsed. In order to be relaxed secular arm, which means to be killed, and her possessions confiscated. She escapes. We don't know what happens to her afterward. William Outlaw is at some point arrested, and apparently he confesses to aiding heretics. There's another letter ordering help for Ledrede. And then after 6 rounds of torture, Petronilla Domitia is burned at the stake on the 3rd of November, 1324, which is the first time anyone was so killed in Ireland, and also in Britain. This part of Ireland is technically under the control of the king at this time. The first time somebody is so burned alive in England is not until 1401, so 1324, so this is about 75 years earlier. On the 17th of January, 1325, William Outlaw was absolved of the crime, and 8 days later, Roger Outlaw and others on William's behalf paid Ledrede £1,000 in 1325. Okay, so according to one standard, or how do you calculate that, it's about $1.3 million, and close enough to that in euros. Right? So our second great source for the trial is the Annals of Ireland by John Clyn, which were written about a decade after the trial, but by somebody here in Kilkenny. So this is what he has to say about it. He tells us that Lady Alice Kyteler was judged, tried, and condemned a heretic by Richard, Bishop of Ossory, and these are the people who were present, and that on the 3rd of November, Petronilla Domitia, who is said to be of the same sect and was a follower of Alice, was similarly condemned for heresy, sorcery, and making burnt offerings to demon, and was delivered to the fire and burned alive. It was neither seen nor heard from times past that anybody had endured the death penalty for heresy in Ireland before her. She was the first according to the memory and testimony of all the people then living. I don't say that she was the first to sin in this way, but she was the first to suffer the just judgment, death on account of heresy. So you see that Clyn is fine with what happened. It's really interesting. He doesn't have much to say about Ledrede himself, but he clearly supported this. So the story of the Kyteler case more or less ends there, but Ledrede had a very long life, and he had a lot more going on, especially in the next 5 years. So we see in the next 5 years, he has 3 more heresy proceedings. He's going to have this bitter feud between himself and Alexander de Bicknor, the Archbishop of Dublin, who had been outside of the country, but he comes back in 1329, and immediately those two are going at it with each other. Alexander de Bicknor is a fascinating person in his own right, but he was not okay with what Ledrede was doing. And this also, with Ledrede's attempts to have other people convicted for heresy, lead to the king himself asking for the popes, the Pope should do something to control Ledrede and also not believe everything that Ledrede has to tell him. And this combination of the resistance to Ledrede and the feuds that he was part of lead to him being exiled from his see for nearly 20 years, from 1329 to 1347. The main feud he had is against Arnold Clare. And to pursue this, he allied with Maurice Fitzthomas, who's the first Earl of Desmond and is quite an interesting character himself. And Allegedly, and there is some evidence to support this, because of this feud with Arnold, when he allied with Maurice, he also became part of a plot to make Maurice the King of Ireland. He succeeds in having Arnold imprisoned for heresy, and he dies in Dublin Castle as he's awaiting the trial for it. He also goes after Roger Outlaw, and Roger Outlaw is able to have himself exonerated. And at this point, and I'm going to get more into that in a second, he turns against another man, Robert Taunton, who we don't know a lot about, but he was clearly a close associate of Maurice Fitzthomas. So at this point, Alexander Bicknor, the Archbishop of Dublin, starts resisting him pretty fiercely. Okay, and then we also have Ledrede also made allegations against the Queen. So this is Isabella, Edward II's wife, who conspires with her lover to have Edward overthrown and replaced with her son, Edward III. And around this time, Ledrede is also said to be slandering the Queen's chamber with accusations of sorcery and other evils, and saying that the king's faithful and loyal people were heretics. And so his temporalities had again been taken into the king's hand. So this is the end of 1326, beginning of 1327. So at some point, Ledrede writes to Edward. At this point, it's Edward III, but Edward III is a child at this point, so it's probably Mortimer that he's writing to, still complaining about things that happened back in 1324. And this is also probably around the time before this, shortly before this, I would say probably in 1327 is when he wrote the narrative of the proceedings against Alice Kyteler. So he is talking about that time that he came in his full episcopal regalia to Leclerc's court, and Arnold wouldn't help him at all. And he's complaining about it, but he's saying it didn't happen to him, it happened to Jesus, because he was holding the Eucharist. So the disrespect that was given to Ledrede presents as Arnold Leclerc being disrespectful to Jesus. And he says that Arnold called the Eucharist devilry and dough, which is similar to what he said in the narrative, which is that worthless, churlish tramp from England with that lump of dough he carries in his hand. But at that point, there was no mention of the devil. So Ledrede adds that mention of the devil because it makes him seem more heretical. He also is going over many of the things that he's saying Arnold is persecuting him in various ways and persecuting the church. I won't get into all the details of that. I will note that he does talk about an attack that he says that Arnold committed on the Priory of St. John of Kilkenny. And then there's this battle between Arnold and Maurice Fitzthomas's people, and the Leclercs lose quite badly, and Ledrede delights in their death. He notes that after this time that they committed this attack on Clonmore, that soon thereafter all died the worst deaths, and dogs and mastiffs chewed their bones just as God wished. So he's taking pleasure in this fate that befell the Leclercs. And the feud between Maurice Fitzthomas and the Leclercs, Maurice Fitzthomas definitely won. The Leclercs did not come out well. He also, in this letter, he actually threatens the king, because he's reminding him that Arnold failed to do his duty as a seneschal. He should have been the one to arrest Alice, and he refused, and that proved him a heretic. So if the king similarly does not support Ledrede, then he will find himself in a similar situation, and then you'll have this situation spreading to the court of England itself. So Arnold is arrested and imprisoned in Dublin Castle, but the case is delayed because Ledrede refuses to come to Dublin. And according to an analyst at the time, since the King's Council did not know how to put an end to this matter, the case was delayed until the next Parliament, which is in early April. And during the delay, Ledrede then turns on Roger Outlaw and accuses him of being a fauteur of Arnold's heresy. But Roger has had enough, and he asks the council for the right to purge himself. And the council agrees. So you get various bishops, abbots, priors, the mayors of Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Waterford, and Drogheda, and many other very prominent people come to Dublin for this purpose. 6 men are elected to decide the case, including William Roger, who's the Dean of St. Patrick's, who had first opposed but then supported Ledrede in 1324. And all of them found Roger honest, faithful, and zealous in his faith. Arnold, however, died in prison a couple months later. So he probably would have been exonerated as well, but he didn't survive. So then the last heresy case that we really have with Ledrede is he goes after Robert Cotton, and we don't know why. It's probable that he really wanted to go after Morris at this time, but he didn't dare go after Morris directly. And Alexander Bickner stands up fiercely for, not just for Robert Cotton, but to tell Ledrede to stop. Again, Ledrede, what he had done in 1324 and since, Alexander Bickner had been outside of the country. He was not there to control him. And Alexander Bickner is the Archbishop of Dublin, so that's over Ossory. So he's his superior, his direct superior. And at the April Parliament in 1329, Bickner invites Ledrede to come visit with him at St. Patrick's, and Ledrede afterwards will claim Bickner tried to kill him and badly beat him. But Bickner cites him to appear before him, but Ledrede does not go to answer him. And Bickner also orders the Seneschal of Kilkenny to release Robert, who was imprisoned at Ledrede's request at that point. So we have a letter from the king, and again, probably Mortimer wrote this at this point in 1329. And it describes the murder and mayhem in Ireland, which Ledrede instigated, and for it to promise pardon to the perpetrators, although, quote, given the nature of his pastoral office, he ought to have used wholesome exhortations to pacify those souls who were agitated with anger. And when the king appointed agents to investigate these events and punish those responsible, as if conscious of his guilt, Ledrede escapes Ireland, and he doesn't escape Ireland, he goes to England, and then he escapes England, and he goes back to the Pope. And so Edward knows, or at least whoever's acting in that capacity at this time, that Ledrede's going to tell the Pope all sorts of things about him, about the Queen, and about the people of Ireland, and he begs him not to listen to those tales. From 1329 to 1347, Ledrede stays out of Ireland. He never feels safe, especially as long as Alexander Bickner is still Archbishop of Dublin. We know several times he came to Avignon to appeal to the Pope from 1329 to 1331, again in 1334 to 1335, and 1346 to 1347, probably also in 1342 to 1343. But other than that, he was in England pretty much the whole time. In December 1334, Jacques Fournier, who was an inquisitor himself, a very methodical inquisitor in the south of France, becomes the Pope. And he proves to be a really fierce advocate for Ledrede as well. And he also faults Edward for not having any inquisitors in either England or Ireland at this time. On the 6th of November in 1335, he asks again that Edward restore Ledrede's temporalities, which again are properties that give Ledrede money, and also that Edward do something about the heretics that Ledrede has identified in Ireland. And it is important to keep in mind, as far as we can tell, he's talking only about other English colonists in Ireland, so he's not talking about the English. We have a letter from 1335 to Edward III, which gives us a lot more information about the allegations that Ledrede is making about these pernicious heretics who wear many faces, saying Jesus was a sinful man whose punishment had been just, and that others are worshiping demons and believe otherwise about the sacrament of the body than did the Roman Catholic Church. The second group is probably referencing what he's saying about the Kyteler case. We don't know about the ones who said that Jesus was sinful and had a just punishment. There's no evidence for that. But saying that they're causing other people to follow them. He also, again, yells at Edward for not having inquisitors in England or Ireland, and to act to aid Ledrede before we see more spreading of various heretical groups this time. On the 3rd of June, Edward does make some progress in the direction that Benedict has asked for, and especially he's annulling the warrant for Ledrede's arrest that Bickner had issued, and that he also listens to Ledrede's complaints against Bickner. Then we also have a new Pope, Clement VI, who instructs the Archbishops of Vermont and Cashel, again, not Dublin, because that's Bickner, and there's that feud there, to start investigating all these claims that Ledrede had made. And he intensifies his letters in 1347, and it reaches a point that Edward agrees to restore the temporalities. That happens, and so then Ledrede is back here by September. We know for his when he came back, even though he had received this pretty extensive pardon, especially after Bickner died in 1349, we see some more problematic behavior, let's say, by Ledrede. And including, so we have the king revoking the pardon in 1347. We're not really clear about why, but it says that there have been multiple counts of sedition. This probably refers to Maurice Fitzthomas, the Earl of Desmond, that Ledrede had been allied with earlier. And then but Ledrede is able to get his temporalities back again in 1355, but then shortly thereafter, they get taken again, in part because Ledrede is directly involved in an attack on a priory that wounds the prior, kills one of the canon, and rips out the eyes and tongues of another. And we know about this one because there's a letter from the Pope telling about it. It's not just the people who have been against Ledrede who are telling about it. And it says that Ledrede had used this brutal attack to force the prior to resign the priory into his hands. And then the prior had gone to the Pope asking for help. And so the Pope was writing this letter. And presumably it's because of this atrocity that his temporalities are again seized, and Ledrede has to submit himself to the king for his many, many transgressions. The last word on Ledrede has to be probably one of my favorites. It's coming from Edward III around 1357, and it's describing, it's to Pope Innocent VI, and it's complaining about Ledrede. It wants to have Ledrede replaced by another man. And so it says that, quote, forgetful of his former mendicancy, meaning he's supposed to be someone who's committed to poverty and simple living rather than lavish wealth and luxury. He trumped up charges of heresy and sorcery against good and faithful people in order to extort money from them. Again, think about the 1,000 pounds that we knew William Outlaw paid in 1325. After his and other victims were thrown in prison to die and their bodies left to rot and buried. And we know this happened to Arnold de Puer. His body was not buried for months because he died excommunicate. So after his request of John XXII to appoint him Inquisitor of England was denied, he contented himself with spreading slander about the state of the faith in Ireland. He has committed multiple crimes of various natures, including murder and arson, for which he has escaped punishment. He continues to oppress his clergy, and his churches are falling into ruin. Due to his advanced age, which the letter says was 100, he probably wasn't that, but he is afflicted with various infirmities, including, quote, having become so deaf that he cannot hear the confessions of the faithful without them shouting, and suffering from dementia almost constantly, although sometimes he enjoys moments of lucidity, which he dedicates to mass. Thus, on behalf of the clergy and people of Ireland, the king asked that Ledrede be removed from office and replaced with the Bishop of Ferns, who Innocent had asked to handle the attack on the priory that happened recently. So now we get to the good. We're almost at the end, and we're at the good here with his Red Book. So, and as you know and can see about so many of the things that he preserved in this Red Book, it's really quite remarkable. He was particularly concerned about the freedom and privileges of the church in respect to secular power, how much independence the church could have, and he thought that the state should serve the church, basically. And so we've got part of Magna Carta that relates to that, as well as this confirmation by Edward I in 1297. We've got the statutes of Second Council of Westminster, again about ecclesiastical and civil jurisdiction. We've got circumspect adjutus of 1286. Again, you see the theme, the difference between secular and spiritual jurisdictions. Articulate clary, which is 30 years later, that again, trying to define those boundaries clearly. The 1319 taxation assessment of Ossory. Remember, he was appointed in 1317. By 1319, he's already said, okay, where am I getting my money? He's gone through and has a clear taxation assessment. We don't have very many of these surviving from the 14th century. We do have one from 1306, but that's not because of William Fitzjohn, that's because of Ledrede. He had compiled it from the Register of the Curia, the Register of the Clerks near London, and the Register at St. Paul's, London. He probably did this in the 6 weeks in which he was in London when he came from Avignon on his way to Kilkenny. We also have the only surviving copies of the constitutions of the Synods of Alexander de Bicknor and John of St. Paul, and Ledrede was their suffragan, meaning he was underneath them as they were the archbishop. So that's why we have these records, not because of the men themselves, but because Ledrede kept good records. We also have materials, aquavitae and other kinds of water, which Anne Neary, who did really great work on Ledrede as an undergraduate, shout out to her. She thinks that it's possible why he had these recipes was because he actually was suffering from a number of maladies that Edward was referencing rather uncharitably. The good is the book. It is the good book, the good Red Book of Ossory. The bad, I think it's the way that he could see slights in almost anything, and the way that he, nursed grudges, and he was willing to commit some, just to say, he made some bad decisions, and a lot of people died because of it, including Petronilla de Midia, including Arnold the Quer, including other people. And then obviously, one of the worst things is the way that this laid the groundwork for the later witch trials that consumed Western Europe. The Kyteler case provides a really remarkable prototype for the witch trials that will later spread. And it's so interesting because Ireland doesn't really see this. We have a couple of other witch trials later, but nothing like other countries in Western Europe, especially, experience. And it's not until like around 1440 that we start seeing more trials like this. So Ledrede was really ahead of his time as far as this went, but obviously what many people would say is a modest estimate that took 50,000 lives just in Europe, the witch trials did. So just to consider some of those things. There was a lot of good, there was also a lot of bad and a lot of ugly. So thank you very much.